A phrase some of you are going to start hearing for the first time is diversity of tactics. And it's worth learning about it and contemplating it now as you decide how you're going to fight back. The idea goes back to the civil rights movement and Malcolm X. There was a lot of debate about whether or not protests for civil rights should be nonviolent. On one side of the debate, there were folks, most famously Martin Luther King Jr., but lots of other prominent voices, pointing out that violence would lead to more violent response from the government and more oppression, and that nonviolence would win the hearts of white supporters and eventually lead to policy changes. And we can see that there were, in fact, concrete demonstrable wins, like the Voting Rights Act and school desegregation. But white liberals of my generation were taught that was proof that the nonviolent side was right all along, that King was the only great hero of the movement, and nonviolence is the only moral response to injustice. And as Alex A. Pagliuca was just correctly pointing out on Blue Sky today, people like me were taught to fetishize nonviolence as though it's a casual attitude and not a rigorous, disciplined practice. Just sit where you're not supposed to. Easy. No. Refusing to fight back while people are screaming at you and spitting on you and punching you and shooting at you goes against every natural instinct. It's hard. It's worthy of respect. It takes training. And it's not for everybody. But this watered-down history, though it might make a passing reference to Malcolm X, doesn't really do justice to the complexity of the debate about diversity of tactics. Malcolm X advocated that people keep their eye on the prize, focus on the desired objectives rather than making enemies of allies because they disagreed about methods. He wasn't the villain in the story advocating for violence. He was the one saying the people who are really rigorous about their commitment to the practice of nonviolence should come together in solidarity with the people who were willing to use violence. And of course, white America saw that as advocacy for violence. It scared the shit out of them. But that may be what moved the Overton window to accomplish exactly what the nonviolent activists wanted. If they wanted to win hearts, having the fear of a violent alternative may have made more white people look to the demands of the nonviolent side of the debate and say, what's the absolute minimum we could give to satisfy that side, so the violent threat is sidelined? So, did the nonviolent side win? Well, look at the biggest tangible gains of the civil rights movement. Schools were desegregated, right? Were they? The Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education ended formal segregation of schools, not on the grounds that all students deserved the best teachers, but that they deserved white teachers. Imagine you were the smartest, straight-A student, brilliant, gifted, able to do anything in your small town in Alabama. And you were white. What could you choose to do in a segregated America? You could go to law school and become a lawyer. You could go to medical school and become a surgeon. You could go into finance and become a stockbroker. Now imagine you were the most gifted student in that same town and you were black. You could get an excellent education at a historically black college or university, and then the most prestigious professions available to you were to become a pastor or some other religious leader, or to become a teacher. So, not to knock teachers and presume they couldn't also be doctors or lawyers or stockbrokers, but just based on the numbers, if we presume that intelligence is evenly distributed across racial groups, and the brightest white minds weren't all going into teaching and the ministry, the black teachers in segregated schools were, on average, the more highly educated, more intelligent teachers. But the Supreme Court didn't start with the assumption that intelligence is equally distributed across racial groups. They started with the racist lie that is the bedrock of white supremacy. So their choice to desegregate the schools was their racist magnanimity, a gesture to lift people they saw as inferior up by exposing them to white educators. They desegregated the schools by firing the black teachers. And then they resegregated the schools. Desegregation is now the law, but de facto segregation is the reality. Schools are more segregated in the United States now than they were before Brown v. Board of Education, based on geography, privatization, school voucher efforts, and other less obvious strategies. Similarly, look at the Voting Rights Act. Do black people have the right to vote now? Yes. But in the same way one can create de facto segregation of schools, the US has created de facto segregation of voting. The Electoral College makes sure a vote in one state is worth more than a vote in another. Look at the racial makeup of the states where a vote has more weight, and look at the racial makeup of the states where a vote has less. And by creating gerrymandered congressional districts, legislatures pack and crack. That means they either crack a voting block into small groups in districts so that that group can't win, or they pack the whole group into one district to make sure they have the least representation possible. Combine this with prohibitions against felons voting and a legal framework under the 13th Amendment that incentivized creating criminal offenses for existing, black in order to re-enslave black people, and you end up with voting rights that are enshrined into law but watered down for black voters in practice. So did the nonviolent side of the debate win? Or did they achieve less than a more violent resistance could have? It's an impossible question. We cannot know what would have happened if there'd been more violence. More bloodshed and more gains? Or more heavy-handed response from the government and more repression? We don't know. Which means the lazy answer I was taught, that nonviolence is obviously the better strategy, isn't justified by what we know. So what justifies it? Of the two alternatives, it was the far more comfortable one for white people. And now, with fascism on the rise in the US in a way that is subjecting a lot more white, cis, and male people to the kinds of oppression the majority of Americans have experienced for longer than the country has been a country, a lot of people are starting to reflect on how they're going to fight back. I'm not going to tell you to consider violent strategies, but I'm also not going to tell you you need to be nonviolent and that will necessarily work, because we don't know that. The most maximally violent movement for social change in American history was the Civil War. The Revolutionary War ended monarchy, but maintained slavery and essentially nobility and peasantry. Remember, only white male landholding men could vote. That's a democracy rather than a monarchy, but not a democracy of the people. It's just a democracy of the landed gentry. The Civil War was a social movement. The movement was not about the North ending slavery. It was about the South trying to preserve slavery, and the North trying to preserve the territorial integrity of the country. But that's still a social movement, just a failed one. The South tried to preserve what they called their way of life, slavery, in a deeply conservative social movement. Generations later, William F. Buckley would describe the conservative movement as standing athwart history and crying, "Stop." Well, nothing was more conservative than the South looking at their ability to hold slaves being threatened by the slow progress of the North and crying, "Stop," in the most violent, bloody way they could. That was a conservative social movement. And did violence work? Again, I was taught that the South lost. They signed an unconditional surrender, right? But did they lose? Or did they just change tactics? Within 8 years, they'd managed to expend the patience of the Northerners who were sick of devoting resources to maintaining the end of slavery in the South, and then they began a generations-long terror campaign to maintain white supremacy. And that terrorist group, the KKK, not only held sway in most of the South, but became a dominant political force in other parts of the country. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I've read that at one point the state with the highest percentage of active KKK members was Indiana, in the North. Meanwhile, the Daughters of the Confederacy focused their efforts on rewriting school textbooks to make sure children, not just in the South, but throughout the country, were taught lies about the causes of the Civil War. You will still meet people who don't believe it was about slavery. And that's not because those people are making some conscious choice to misunderstand. It's because they're ignorant and repeating the lies they were taught. So did the South lose because it employed violence? Or did it lose when it employed state violence on a mass scale, and then win when it employed a combination of violent terrorism and nonviolent propaganda? Howard Zinn, in his essay, The Limits of Nonviolence, wrote, "To insist on perfect tranquility with an absolute rejection of violence may mean surrendering the right to change an unjust social order. On the other hand, to seek justice at any cost may result in bloodshed so great that its evil overshadows everything else and splatters the goal beyond recognition. The problem is to weigh carefully the alternatives, so as to achieve the maximum of social progress with a minimum of pain. Society has been guilty of much quick and careless weighing in the past. On the other hand, it has permitted the most monstrous injustices, which it might have eliminated with a bit of trouble. This point has really hit me recently. Some guy who supports the current fascist regime in the US has been coming onto one of my social media accounts to advocate for genocide in Gaza. So he simultaneously believes that no one should violently protest the actions of the Trump administration, but that the appropriate response to the violence of a group of extremist freedom fighters who chose horrific, bloody violence as their tactic is to eliminate the entire ethnic group that small group was fighting for. I, on the other hand, think that horrific terrorism is wrong on principle, no matter the righteousness of the cause, and that genocide is never justified, even if some people believe it will lead to their long-term security to have a neighboring group entirely eliminated. He demands complete nonviolent subservience here and justifies wholesale slaughter of innocent men, women, and children abroad. And I will never accept any justification for genocide, and I'm no longer completely sold on nonviolence as the only tactic to achieve justice. I do know it's not my personal role. I am too old and weak to be punching Nazis in the streets on the daily. But I have come around to Malcolm X's position on the diversity of tactics, and I respect people who choose different ways to fight back. Once you start learning about the actual difficulty of nonviolence and questioning whether it actually works, you may need to do some soul searching about what role you want to fill to fight back against fascism. For you, it might be using your financial power by engaging in and promoting boycotts and disinvestment efforts. In that case, diversity of tactics means respecting other people's boycott efforts and engaging in them as much as you can. Or your role might be withholding your labor in the form of organized strikes. In this case, diversity of tactics means standing in solidarity, not crossing picket lines to work when there are others striking, and not shopping at businesses where their workers strike. For me, my role is art. I'm a writer and a publisher, so that's where my skills can best be employed. Art is a tactic in the battle against fascism. Some people make art that maintains the status quo and actively promotes the people currently in power, and some try to make non-political art, which is impossible and generally serves to maintain the status quo and protect the people currently in power. And then some of us try to make art that challenges the status quo and threatens the people currently in power. The latter is anti-fascist art. And it doesn't all have to be grim and dystopic to be anti-fascist. Hell, take a really good picture of the beautiful couple at a gay wedding, and that's beautiful anti-fascist art. One could make a good argument that members of marginalized communities, if they just exist in the world, proud and joyful in their own skin, are producing beautiful anti-fascist performance art, because that existence challenges the status quo and threatens those currently in power. It is beautiful. Make anti-fascist art and support anti-fascist artists. And if you believe in diversity of tactics, that means supporting those artists by consuming, promoting, and disseminating their work. When it comes to street protests, diversity of tactics is not just something practiced by Black Bloc and Antifa protesters. I was talking with the author David A. Campbell for this next week's Writers Not Writing, and we were discussing the ways the people where he lives, in Paris, France, engage in huge protest efforts. He said, you will see young extremists setting fires to cars and waving burning flags, and you'll see old pensioners walking behind them, maybe shaking their heads a bit, but not disavowing them, still standing in solidarity with them. They might not have chosen the same methods, but they stand together because they share Malcolm X's belief. As long as we agree on objectives, we should never fall out with each other just because we believe in different methods or tactics or strategy to reach a common goal. So, as the fascist regime tries to justify retaliatory violence to protests, bear this in mind. They want some of you to turn on the protesters and say, they went too far. I'm not with them anymore. The alternative to being with those protesters is being with the fascist regime. Yes, there is absolutely a point where bloodshed is unacceptable. But don't fall into the trap Zinn called careless weighing. The fascist regime is already doing terrible violence, disappearing thousands of people and enacting policies that will cause the deaths of tens of thousands. Even a conservative estimate of the death toll from Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill is 52,000 premature American deaths, and the cuts to foreign aid will kill far more. So keep that in mind before you side with the fascists because of extra traffic, or a burning cop car, or some broken windows, or even some bloodied ICE Gestapo agents. Maybe you don't choose violence, but the government already has. So stand with the people who are fighting back, even if they aren't fighting back in your favorite way.